Before we begin, we wanted to give a quick thank you to Robert, who left a donation on Buy Me a Coffee this week. Robert, we genuinely appreciate it. Every one of those goes straight back into making these episodes, and it means a great deal that you took the time. Thank you. There is a path at Versailles that does not appear on any modern map. It is not hidden, it is not fenced off, it is not guarded by anything you could photograph. It is simply there, somewhere between the manicured hedges and the long reflecting water, waiting for the kind of visitor who takes a wrong turn without noticing they have taken one at all. They were not adventurers. They were not mystics. They were not the sort of people who invented stories for attention. They were educated, careful, unromantic women who had spent their lives correcting the imprecise language of others. One of them ran a college. The other would go on to run it after her. They had come to France for the ordinary reasons that people come to France, and they had come to Versailles on that particular afternoon because the weather was pleasant and the guidebook suggested it. What they described afterward has never been satisfactorily explained. The sound stopped first, not softened, stopped. The birds, the wind moving through the leaves, the distant murmur of other tourists somewhere behind them on the grounds, all of it drained away in the space of a few steps, the way a room goes quiet when a door closes behind you. The air grew heavy and still and strangely flat, as though the world around them had been pressed under glass. The light changed. The trees looked wrong somehow, though neither woman could say exactly how. And then there were people. People in clothing that belonged to another century entirely. People who moved through the gardens with the unhurried certainty of those who lived there. People who did not look at the two English women at all, who behaved in fact as though the two English women were not standing in front of them. Near a small stone building, on a slope of grass that should have been open lawn, a woman sat alone with paper in her lap and a wide pale hat shading her face, sketching. Years later, after comparing what they'd seen against portraits in a gallery, both women became convinced they knew exactly who that woman was, Marie Antoinette, who had been dead for more than 100 years, 1792. France has stopped being a kingdom. It has happened quickly, the way these things always happen quickly at the very end after moving slowly for decades, and the enormous machinery of the monarchy has simply stopped turning. The king is a prisoner. The queen is a prisoner. The great rooms of the palace stand empty with their shutters closed, and the furniture has been carried out and catalogued and sold, and the mirrors reflect nothing but each other and the grey light coming off the water outside. Out in the gardens at the far end of the estate, past the long canal and the avenue of trees, there is a smaller building that most visitors to Versailles in those days never bothered to walk to. It is modest by the standards of the place, which is to say it is merely beautiful rather than overwhelming. It has a small theatre. It has an artificial village with a working dairy. It has a garden designed to look accidental, which is the most expensive kind of garden there is. This is the Petit Trianon, the Queen's private retreat, the one corner of Versailles where she was allowed to pretend for a few hours at a time that she was not the most watched woman in Europe. And on a grey morning in October of that year, an old man walks out to it for the last time. He has been a gardener on the estate for most of his life. His father was a gardener here. His father's father helped plant some of the trees he now stands beneath. He knows the drainage of every slope. He knows which corners hold frost longest in the spring. He knows exactly how many steps it takes to walk from the little theatre to the edge of the water, because he has walked it perhaps 10,000 times, and he has never once needed to count. He has been told to leave, not asked, told. The new order of things has no particular use for royal gardeners, and there is talk that the trees themselves may be sold for timber, and the old man has been given until the end of the week to gather what belongs to him and go. What belongs to him fits in one canvas bag. He does not weep. Men of his generation and his station did not, as a rule, and besides, he has been expecting this for 2 years. Instead, he does something that no one witnesses and no one records. He walks past the little theatre and past the mock village, and out to a particular tree at the eastern edge of the grounds. An ordinary tree, not the largest or the oldest or the finest. and he kneels down in the wet grass with a hand trowel that he has carried in that canvas bag all morning. He digs a hole about the depth of his forearm. Into it he places a piece of dressed stone roughly the size of a book. It is not valuable, it is not gold, and it holds no jewel, and there is nothing about it that would tempt a thief. It has been cut and smoothed and carved with a chisel by a man who was not a professional carver, and the letters are uneven, and one of them has been started twice. The inscription reads, "The garden must never be forgotten." He covers it over. He presses the soil back down with the flat of his hand twice, the way you would settle a blanket. He stands up slowly, because he is old and the ground is cold, and he brushes his knees, and he looks at the tree for a while. Then he picks up his bag and walks out of Versailles and out of history, and no record of his name survives. Here is the strange part. He did not bury that stone because he loved the garden, or rather, he did not bury it only for that reason. Gardeners have loved gardens for as long as there have been gardens, and none of the others buried anything. He buried it because of what his father had told him, and what his father's father had told his father, going back further than anyone in the family could properly account for. A piece of instruction passed down through 4 generations of men who worked that particular corner of the estate, phrased always in exactly the same words, never written down, never explained. The instruction was this: if you are ever walking near the Queen's house and the birds go quiet all at once, do not turn around, do not speak. Keep walking the way you were already walking, and do not stop until you hear the birds again. The old man had heard the birds go quiet exactly twice in 51 years. Both times he had kept walking. Both times, when the sound came back, he found himself standing somewhere he had not intended to be, with no memory of the distance between. He never told anyone. Who would he have told, and what would he have said? So instead he buried a stone, with a sentence on it, under a tree, so that the ground itself would carry the message after he was gone. The garden must never be forgotten. He meant it as a warning. 109 years later, on the 10th of August, in the year 1901, 2 women stepped off a train and into the town of Versailles with a guidebook, a shared umbrella, and no particular sense of occasion. Charlotte Ann Moberly was 55 years old. She was the daughter of a bishop, the 10th of 15 children, and she'd grown up in the enormous echoing corridors of Winchester College, where her father was headmaster. She had been running St. Hugh's Hall at Oxford for some years by then, one of the first residential halls for women in the university, and she had done it by being immovable. She was not warm. She was not unkind either. She was the sort of woman who would notice an error in a Latin inscription from across a room and mention it once, quietly, and then never mention it again. Eleanor Jourdain was 10 years younger. She was a scholar of French history and literature. She kept a school in Watford, and she spent a good part of every year in France, where she had a small circle of friends and an excellent ear for the language. She was quicker than Moberly, more social, more inclined to laugh. She was also, in her own way, exactly as stubborn. They had met only a few months earlier. Jourdain was being considered as vice principal of the hall, and Moberly, being Moberly, had decided that the only sensible way to evaluate a colleague was to travel with her. So they went to Paris together, in the heat of August, on what was essentially a very long and very polite job interview. By the 10th of the month they had exhausted most of the city. The weather was heavy. Paris in August empties out and turns close and airless, and both women were tired of galleries. Jourdain suggested Versailles. Moberly agreed without much enthusiasm. Neither of them was particularly interested in palaces. They took the train. They toured the state apartments with the crowd dutifully, and found them exhausting in the way that enormous rooms full of gilding tend to be. Afterward, standing in the vast open geometry of the gardens, Jourdain mentioned that there was a smaller house at the far end of the estate that had belonged to Marie Antoinette. Neither woman knew much about it. Moberly, by her own later admission, was not entirely sure who Marie Antoinette had been beyond the obvious outline of her ending. They decided to walk out to it. This is the detail that matters more than any other, and it is the detail that gets lost every time the story is retold as a ghost story. They were not looking for anything. They had no interest in the occult. They did not know the history of the place they were walking into. They were two tired women killing an afternoon before dinner, walking toward a building they could not have described. They did not hire a guide. They had a small map from the guidebook, which was inadequate, and they took a wrong turn almost immediately. Somewhere past the Grand Trianon they left the main avenue and went up a lane that seemed to head in roughly the right direction. It did not. They came to a place where the way divided, and they took the branch that looked more promising, and after that the afternoon began to come apart. Moberly wrote later that she was the first to notice the change but said nothing, because there was nothing to say. A feeling of depression, she called it, an oppression. It arrived without cause and settled over her like weather. She looked at Jourdain, walking beside her, and thought that Jourdain seemed perfectly content, and decided that she was being ridiculous and kept quiet. Jourdain, writing separately, described exactly the same thing. A sudden heaviness, a wish that she had not suggested the walk. She looked at Moberly and thought that Moberly seemed perfectly content, and decided that she was being ridiculous and kept quiet. Neither of them mentioned it to the other for 3 months. They passed some buildings, a farmhouse, deserted, with a plough left in a doorway. Beyond it the ground rose, and the light through the trees took on the flat quality of a photograph. And then the sound went. This is the part that people who have never experienced it find hardest to imagine, because ordinary quiet is not the same thing at all. Ordinary quiet is full of information. There is the small settling of leaves, the shift of air, the faraway compression of a city going about its business. Even in the deepest countryside there is a floor of sound underneath everything, and your ear rests on it without your ever noticing. That floor was gone. Both women described the trees as looking flat, like something woven into tapestry. Both described the air as dead and still, without the faintest movement, on an August afternoon when there had been a breeze 5 minutes earlier. Both described a feeling that they had walked into a scene rather than a place. And then they began to meet people. The first were 2 men beside a wheelbarrow, working near a heap of gravel or soil, wearing long greyish-green coats and small tricorn hats. Moberly took them for gardeners. She thought their clothing was probably some kind of estate livery. Unusual, but not impossible, because she was a practical woman, and practical women find explanations quickly. Jourdain asked them the way. One of them answered without much interest and gestured straight ahead. Both women remembered the gesture. Neither could later remember the exact words, and neither could remember hearing footsteps as the men moved, which is the kind of detail that only becomes strange in retrospect. Then came the cottage, where a woman stood in a doorway holding out a jug to a girl of about 13 or 14. Jourdain noticed everything about them, the way a scholar of costume notices things. The woman's white kerchief, the girl's odd close bodice, the way the pair of them were arranged, both leaning slightly, the jug held out, the hand not quite taking it, not frozen exactly, not still, the way a photograph is still, held, as though the moment they were in was slightly longer than a moment ought to be. Jourdain wrote afterward that the 2 figures looked as if they had been placed there, that the whole scene had an artificial flatness to it, that she wanted very badly to walk faster and did not know why. They came to a wood. Here the oppression became something closer to fear, and both women separately described the same specific sensation, which is that they felt they should not look back over their shoulders. Not that they were afraid to, that it would be wrong to, that something about the arrangement of the afternoon depended on them continuing to face forward. More than a century earlier, an old gardener had received the same instruction from his father, phrased almost identically, and had passed it on to no one. At the edge of the wood there was a small circular structure, a kind of ornamental kiosk or bandstand, and beside it, sitting on the steps, was a man. Both women wrote about this man at length, and both women hated him. That is not too strong. Moberly, who chose her words like a barrister, called his expression evil and yet unseeing. His face was dark and heavily pockmarked. He wore a large slouch hat and a heavy dark cloak in August in the heat, and he sat with his back partly turned and looked at nothing. The look on his face, she wrote, was the most repulsive thing she had ever seen on a human being, and yet it was not directed at them, and that made it worse rather than better. They were now genuinely frightened and did not know what to do. Then someone came running. Both women heard him before they saw him, which is worth noting because it was the first sound either of them had heard in some minutes. He came from behind, moving fast, a tall man with dark curling hair under a wide sombrero-style hat, and a dark cloak wrapped across his chest, and he was flushed and excited, and he called out to them in French. He told them they had gone the wrong way. He told them not to pass that way. He told them to go instead to the right, and find the house that way, and he gestured sharply twice. They thanked him. They turned as he had directed, and when they turned back to look, an instant later, on an open path with clear sight lines in every direction, the man was gone. There was no sound of running feet going away. There was nowhere to have gone. Jourdain, who spoke excellent French, noted something else. His accent was strange, not regional, not foreign. Old-fashioned, she thought, in a way she could not place, the way a person from the last century would sound if you could somehow arrange to hear one. They crossed a small rustic bridge over a ravine with a trickle of water below it, walking through trees, and came out into open ground. And there, ahead of them, at the corner of a terrace, was the little house, the Petit Trianon, and sitting on the grass in front of it, quite alone, was a lady. Only one of them saw her. That fact has been used for 100 years to dismiss the entire account, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is stranger than it first appears. Moberly saw the lady clearly and at length. Jourdain, walking beside her, on the same path, at the same instant, saw an empty lawn. Moberly did not mention it. She assumed the lady was a tourist, an eccentric one, certainly, but Versailles has never been short of eccentric visitors, and it was not Moberly's habit to comment on strangers. Here is what she saw. A woman was sitting on the grass a little way from the terrace, quite alone, with her back mostly toward the house, and her face turned partly toward the approaching path. She was not young, not old either. She had a great deal of fair hair, arranged in a way Moberly found unusual, and she wore a light summer dress with a low neck and a shading hat, pale, wide-brimmed, of a kind that had not been in fashion for a very long time. She had a sheet of paper held out at arm's length in front of her. She was looking at it, and then looking up, and then looking at it again, in the specific rhythm of someone drawing something they can see. Moberly's overwhelming impression, and she came back to this word again and again for the rest of her life, was that the woman looked bored, not sad, not spectral, not tragic, simply a woman on an afternoon with time she did not know what to do with, sketching a garden she had already sketched too many times. Moberly walked past her at a distance of perhaps 30 feet. She noticed the fabric. She noticed the way the dress was cut, and she noticed that it was strange, and she thought, in her sensible way, that the woman was probably an artist, and artists dress as they like. Then she and Jourdain went up onto the terrace, and a young man came out of a door in the building with a great deal of noise and a slam that made them both jump, and he offered to show them the way around to the front, and everything changed back. That is the phrase Moberly used. Everything changed back. The heaviness lifted. The air moved. Somewhere a bird made a sound. There was a wedding party in the courtyard on the far side, laughing, in modern clothes, being photographed, and the two women joined the ordinary crowd of tourists and went through the little house with everyone else, and looked at the rooms and remarked on the furniture. They took tea at a hotel afterward. They talked about the college. Neither of them said a word about the afternoon. For an entire week, Moberly said nothing. She had a distinct feeling that something about the excursion had been wrong, and she found she was reluctant to examine it. Then, sitting down to write a letter to her sister about the trip, she found she could not describe Versailles at all, without describing the depression and the flatness and the man in the cloak. She put her pen down and went to find Jourdain and asked her, as lightly as she could manage, whether she thought the Petit Trianon was haunted. Jourdain, without hesitating, said yes, and then, according to both of them, they sat down and compared what they had seen and discovered two things at once. The first was that they had seen most of the same things: the men with the wheelbarrow, the bridge, the kiosk, the dreadful man, the running man who vanished, the precise quality of the silence and the flatness of the trees, and the feeling that they must not look behind them. The second was that they had not seen all of the same things. Jourdain had seen a cottage with a woman and a girl and a jug, and Moberly had walked past that spot and seen no cottage at all. Moberly had seen a lady sketching on the grass, and Jourdain had seen only lawn. They were both, in that moment, sitting in a room in England, entirely sober, extremely well educated, and about to spend the next 20 years of their lives on a question neither of them had asked for. They agreed to write down separate accounts without discussing the details further. They did. Those accounts survive, and they can be compared, and the overlaps in them are the most persuasive thing about the entire affair, because two people fabricating a story together get the shared details right and the private ones wrong. These two got the shared details right and the private ones stranger. Then Jourdain went back. That is the part people forget. In January of 1902, alone, in winter, she returned to Versailles and walked out to the Trianon again. And she found that she could not retrace the route. The paths did not connect the way she remembered. The bridge she had crossed did not appear to exist. The ravine was not there. But standing in the grounds on that cold January afternoon, she heard music. Faint, thin, orchestral, the kind of light court music that had not been played in those gardens for well over a century. She heard voices too, and the sound of someone dragging something heavy over dry leaves, though the ground she was standing on was bare, and the heaviness came back down over her exactly as it had in August. She went home and wrote it down. Over the following decade, the two women researched obsessively and privately. They went into the French archives, they pulled estate maps, they read court memoirs, and what they found is the reason this story has never entirely gone away. Consider what they were doing. They were checking a description of a garden, written from memory by two women who had never studied the place, against the physical layout of that garden as it had existed in the 1780s. They found the bridge, not the modern one. There was a small rustic bridge over a ravine in that part of the grounds during the reign of Louis XVI, in roughly the position Jourdain had described, and it was gone long before either woman was born. They found the kiosk. A small circular garden structure had stood near where they placed it, and had been removed decades earlier. They found the cottage, and then they found the plough. The deserted farm building they had passed, with an old plough standing in the doorway, appeared on none of the modern plans, but an inventory of the estate from the 1780s recorded in the flat administrative language of such documents a plough in exactly that place. Moberly and Jourdain had walked past an 18th century inventory item and thought nothing of it, and only found it years later, written down by a clerk who died before the Revolution. They kept going. They found records suggesting the terrace they had approached from an odd angle had once been laid out differently, with paths where there was now grass and grass where there was now path. They found that the direction the running man had sent them was, according to the older plans, the correct direction, and that the way they had originally been going would have taken them nowhere at all. And they found, in a portrait, a face. Moberly had never studied Marie Antoinette. She said so plainly, and there is no reason to doubt her. But at some point during the research she was shown a painting by Wertmüller, and she stopped, and she said that this was the woman she had seen sitting on the grass. The clothing matched, the hat matched, the hair matched, and the expression matched, which is the detail that has always unsettled me most, because the woman Moberly described was not the tragic figure of the history books. She was bored, and she was slightly cross, and she was drawing something she did not really want to draw, which is exactly the woman who is documented as having spent long afternoons at the Petit Trianon in the years before everything came apart, sketching and finding it dull and staying anyway because it was quieter there than anywhere else in France. They published in 1911 under false names in a book called An Adventure. It was ridiculed almost immediately, and it sold extremely well, and both women spent the rest of their lives refusing to take back a single word. Charlotte Moberly died in 1937 at 91 years old. Eleanor Jourdain died suddenly in 1924 at 58 in the middle of a bitter dispute at Oxford, and there are those who say the strain of the affair contributed to it. Neither ever offered another explanation, and there the matter would have rested, a curiosity, a footnote, a favourite subject for people who like arguing about whether other people are liars. Except that in the spring of 2011, a historian named Lucien Moreau decided to walk the route. Moreau was not a believer in anything. That is worth establishing early, because the conspiracy that follows requires a skeptic at the centre of it, or it collapses into wishful thinking. He was an archival historian at a small institution outside Paris, specialising in the administrative records of the late Bourbon monarchy, which is to say he spent his professional life reading receipts, timber purchases, drainage contracts, the wages of men who cleaned fountains. It is unglamorous work, and he loved it, because receipts do not lie about themselves the way memoirs do. A memoir tells you what a man wanted to be remembered for. A receipt tells you what he actually bought. He came to the Moberly and Jourdain affair sideways, as most people do. He was preparing a paper on the landscaping expenditures of the Trianon estate, and a colleague made a joke about the two English ghost hunters, and Moreau, who did not know the story, looked it up that evening to be polite. What caught him was not the lady on the grass. It was the plough. Because Moreau had read that inventory. He had read hundreds like it, and he understood, in a way that a casual reader would not, exactly how obscure a document that was. It was not a famous list. It was not in any published history of Versailles. It was a working record produced by estate staff for estate purposes, and in 1901 it was sitting uncatalogued in a French archive that an English schoolmistress on a summer holiday had no realistic way of consulting before her visit. You cannot see a thing in a garden because you read about it in a document you have not read. Moreau spent that night reading the rest of it, and by morning he was annoyed, which in his case was the same thing as being interested. In the spring of the following year he took a week of leave and went to Versailles with a satchel full of photocopies, and he did what almost no one had properly done in a century. He tried to walk the exact route, in the exact order, against the 18th century plans rather than the modern ones. He did it 11 times over 9 days. Here is what he found, and here is where the documented history quietly ends and this story begins. 6 of the features the two women described corresponded to structures that existed on the estate before the Revolution, and did not exist in 1901. That much has been argued about for decades, and Moreau expected it. What he did not expect was the 7th. In Jourdain's account there is a small detail that nobody has ever paid much attention to because it is not dramatic. She describes, in passing, the way the ground fell away to her left as they approached the wood, and mentions a line of trees running at an angle that struck her as strange because it did not match the formality of everything else. Moreau found that line of trees on a plan from 1774. It was not merely removed before 1901. It was removed before 1789. It was cut down and replanted during a redesign of the estate that took place while Marie Antoinette was still alive and still using the house, and the new arrangement was the one that survived. Which meant that Jourdain had not described the gardens as they were in the years before the Revolution. She had described them as they were before that, in a configuration that had lasted roughly 15 years and then vanished. And the plough, and the cottage, and the kiosk, and the bridge all fit that same window. Moreau sat down on a bench near the Grand Canal with his photocopies on his knees and worked it through twice, and then a third time, and each time he arrived at the same absurd conclusion. The two women had not seen a general impression of the past. They had seen a specific afternoon. You do not accidentally hallucinate a coherent moment. Dreams do not maintain their furniture. If two exhausted tourists in 1901 had constructed a fantasy of old France, that fantasy would have contained the France of their own imaginations, which is to say the France of paintings and popular books and the revolution they had read about in school. It would have contained powdered wigs and courtiers and possibly a guillotine. Instead, they described a working estate on a slow afternoon, with labourers moving gravel, a woman handing a jug to a girl, an abandoned plough, and a bored aristocrat drawing a picture she did not care about. That is not the past as anyone imagines it. That is the past as it actually was on a Tuesday. Moreau went back to the archives, and this time he was not looking for the two English women. He was looking for everyone else. He had a simple question. If something occasionally happens in that particular corner of that particular estate, then over 300 years of continuous occupation somebody else must have noticed. It took him 4 months to find the first one, and after that they came quickly, because once you know the shape of a thing, you can see it everywhere. The reports were not filed under anything sensible. They were scattered through police records, medical notes, disciplinary hearings, and the correspondence of minor officials, and they were almost never described as supernatural because the people writing them were not writing about ghosts. They were writing about staff problems. A groundskeeper in 1846 who abandoned his post in the middle of a shift and was found 2 hours later at the edge of the estate, unable to account for himself, insisting the paths had rearranged. A pair of soldiers in 1871 during the occupation who reported hearing a large number of people talking somewhere ahead of them in an empty section of the park, and who were disciplined for leaving their position. A schoolteacher in 1928 who wrote a long complaining letter to the estate administration about a group of costume performers who had frightened her pupils, and who received a polite reply explaining that no such performance had taken place. 3 separate gardeners between 1950 and 1963 who requested transfers away from the Trianon section, none of whom gave a reason, all of whom were quietly accommodated. And further back than the two women, further back than the Revolution, in a bundle of correspondence from the reign of Louis XIV, a letter from a court official complaining that construction work at the far end of the estate was being delayed because the labourers refused to work in one section after dusk. The letter does not say why. It does not need to. The official is not asking for an investigation. He is asking for permission to pay them more. That was the pattern Moreau began to notice, and it is the pattern that turned an interesting historical puzzle into something that kept him awake. The reports were never followed up, not suppressed. That would have been suspicious in itself, and it would have left traces because suppression is a loud activity that generates its own paperwork. This was quieter and far more effective. Every single incident was received, recorded, filed, and then simply allowed to stop. No inquiry, no referral, no official concluding that the witnesses were mistaken, which is what you would expect, because bureaucracies love writing down that someone was mistaken. Just an ending. Every time. For 300 years. And the filing was odd too. Moreau, who had spent 20 years inside French administrative systems, noticed that these particular documents were consistently misfiled in a very particular way. They were placed in categories where they did not belong, but always in adjacent categories. The sort of mistake a tired clerk might make once and would not make 40 times. Grounds maintenance reports filed under water rights, police statements filed under fire safety, a medical note filed under a heading concerning the movement of livestock. Every one of them was findable. None of them were findable together. It took Moreau most of a year to assemble the pattern, working evenings, and he later said that the thing which frightened him was not the content of the documents. It was the realization that someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure a person could only ever find one at a time. The thread that took him out of the archives and into something much older began with weather. Among the misfiled documents was a set of observations that did not belong to the estate at all. They were astronomical. They came from the old Royal Observatory in Paris, an institution founded in the 1660s by a king who understood that a country which could measure the sky could measure everything else, and they had ended up in the Versailles grounds files for no reason Moreau could establish. They were tables, columns of figures recording solar altitude, barometric pressure, and magnetic declination, taken on specific dates. 23 dates, spread across 140 years. Moreau nearly discarded them. Then he cross-referenced the dates against his growing list of incidents, out of nothing more than tidiness, and found that 11 of the 23 matched exactly. Not approximately, exactly. The letter that accompanied the tables was short and it was not signed. It said that the conditions had been observed as requested, and that the correspondent remained of the opinion that the alignment was insufficient. It thanked its recipient for the additional funds. Moreau spent the next 2 years pulling that thread, and what he assembled from it is either the most elaborate coincidence in the history of French record-keeping, or it is the thing this episode is actually about. Court astronomers, from the reign of Louis XIV onward, were quietly monitoring the Trianon grounds, not the sky above them, the grounds themselves. They were recording 4 variables: the precise angle of the sun, atmospheric pressure at ground level, fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field, which they measured with compass needles suspended in oil, and which they did not understand but recorded scrupulously anyway. And a 4th column, unlabelled in most of the documents, which was simply a number that increased by 1 each year and reset. It took Moreau an embarrassingly long time to work out that the 4th column was a count. The astronomers were tracking a cycle, and when he plotted the resets, the interval came out to a fraction over 84 years. 84 years is not a mystical number. It is a deeply unglamorous number, which is part of why Moreau found it credible. It is roughly the orbital period of Uranus. It is also the interval on which several long-term geomagnetic and solar patterns come into rough phase with one another, and it is long enough that no individual human being will ever personally witness more than one of them properly, which is the practical problem, and it is a beautiful one when you think about it. If a phenomenon repeats every 84 years, it is effectively invisible to individuals and visible only to institutions. A man who sees it at 20 will be dead before it comes again. The only way to notice the pattern at all is to be an organisation that outlives its members and keeps careful notes. Monarchies are organisations that outlive their members and keep careful notes. So are churches. So are intelligence services. The 1899 reset would have made the next significant convergence fall in the early years of the 20th century. The 10th of August, 1901, sits inside that window. Moreau checked the weather records for that afternoon 3 separate times because he did not believe them. Barometric pressure that day was unusually high and unusually stable across the region. There is a note in a meteorological bulletin from that week describing conditions across northern France as remarkably settled, with almost no air movement recorded at several stations. 2 women had walked into a garden on the stillest afternoon of the year, on a date that a dead astronomer had circled 150 years earlier, and had complained, in their own words, that the air did not move and that the trees looked flat. The final piece came from a private collection. In 2016, a family in the Loire sold the contents of a house that had been in their possession since before the Revolution. Among the papers was the working journal of a man who had served as a secretary and advisor in the household of Louis XVI, a functionary of no historical importance whatsoever, the kind of man whose name appears in the margins of other people's stories. The journal is mostly tedious. Appointments, complaints about a colleague, extensive notes on the price of candles, and then, beginning in 1778, a series of entries concerning something the writer refers to only as the Commission. He never states its full name in the early pages, which is itself a tell because a man does not abbreviate something he has never written out. Later, twice, carelessly, he writes it in full. The Window Commission. Its membership was small: an astronomer, a royal architect, a physician, a priest. though the journal is careful to specify that the priest attended in a private capacity and not on behalf of the church. And two men whose function is never described, which in the 18th century usually meant they were there to decide what happened to people. Its budget was drawn from the household accounts of the Queen rather than the Treasury, which meant it did not have to be explained to anyone, and its purpose, stated once and never repeated, was to observe and report upon the recurring irregularities in the gardens of the Trianon estate, and to determine whether they presented a danger to the person of the king. Read that again, slowly, not whether they were real. That question is not asked anywhere in the journal. It is not asked because by 1778 it had apparently been settled, by whom, and on what evidence the writer does not say. The only open question was whether they were dangerous. The commission met 11 times over 6 years. The journal records fragments, a note that the physician had examined 2 witnesses and found no disorder of the mind in either, a note that the architect had been asked to prepare drawings of the watercourses, a note in 1781 that the priest had withdrawn and would not be replaced, with no explanation given. And one entry, in the autumn of 1783, that Moreau photographed 40 times and had independently authenticated twice. It reads, in translation, "The astronomer maintains his position that we are not observing the dead. He states that the persons observed are as living as ourselves and are simply not here now. The physician objects that this is worse. I find I agree with the physician." The last entry mentioning the commission is from 1787. It notes that the work will continue under other arrangements, and that certain papers have been removed for safekeeping, and that the writer has been thanked for his service and instructed to say nothing. 2 years later the Bastille fell, and within 4 years the king was dead and the queen was dead, and the household accounts that had funded the whole enterprise were being read aloud in a courtroom as evidence of royal extravagance. Nobody asked what the window commission had been for. Nobody, as far as any surviving record shows, has ever asked since. So let us take the astronomer seriously for a moment, the way the physician did, and see where it leads. We are not observing the dead. The persons observed are as living as ourselves and are simply not here now. Everything the popular version of this story gets wrong flows from a single assumption, which is that Moberly and Jourdain travelled, that they were somehow lifted out of 1901 and set down in 1789 and then returned. It is the assumption every retelling makes, and it creates immediate and fatal problems. If they travelled, why did the wedding party in modern dress appear in the courtyard while they were still in the grounds? If they travelled, why did only one of them see the lady on the grass? If they travelled, why could they hear a man speaking to them in old-fashioned French while the men with the wheelbarrow made no sound of footsteps at all? Travel does not produce those results. Travel is clean. You're either in one year or you're in another. What the commission concluded, according to the fragments Moreau assembled, was something considerably stranger and considerably more elegant. Nobody goes anywhere. Instead, at certain places, under certain conditions, 2 moments in time briefly occupy the same physical space. They overlap, not merge. Overlap the way 2 panes of glass laid one on top of the other are still 2 panes of glass, but you can look through both at once, and the people inside those moments continue doing exactly what they were doing, in their own year, without interruption, because from their point of view nothing has happened at all. Think about what that means from the other side. On a warm afternoon in the 1770s, 2 men are moving gravel near the Trianon. A woman hands a jug to a girl in a doorway. A young queen sits on the grass being bored at a sketchbook she has already filled, and for a few minutes 2 women in extraordinary clothing walk past. Long dark skirts to the ground, odd tight sleeves, absurd hats. They walk quickly and they look frightened, and one of them asks for directions in strangely accented French. The gravel men would answer, because you answer a question, and then they would go back to work and think nothing more of it. Foreigners visited Versailles constantly. Foreigners dressed peculiarly. That was practically the definition of a foreigner. The Queen would glance up from her paper at the 2 women crossing the lawn, and then look back down, because she has been stared at by strangers every single day of her life since she was 14 years old, and she has long since stopped finding it interesting. Nobody in 1779 sees a ghost. They see tourists. And this, if you follow it honestly, resolves nearly every strange detail in the account at once. The silence. If two moments overlap, you would hear the sounds of whichever moment your body actually occupied, which is your own, and your own moment in that empty corner of the estate on a still August afternoon in 1901 was genuinely almost silent. The people you were seeing were making noise in their own year, and their noise stayed there. That is why the men with the wheelbarrow moved without footsteps. That is why the figures in the doorway were held rather than frozen. The running man is the exception, and the exception proves the rule. He is the only figure who interacts with them urgently, at length, and audibly. He is the only one who is out of breath. He is the only one who tells them they have gone the wrong way, and that they must not pass that way. He knew. Whatever he was, whoever he was, he knew what was happening, and he was trying to move two civilians away from something. And then he was gone, on open ground, in an instant, because the overlap did not need him to walk away. It simply stopped including him. The man on the kiosk steps is harder, and Moreau never claimed to have solved him. Both women described a face that repelled them beyond anything they had experienced, and both described the strange fact that he was not looking at them. He was looking at nothing. One reading is that he was sitting in his own afternoon in some private misery, and they simply caught him at it, and there is nothing more disturbing than seeing an unguarded human face that does not know it is being seen. Another reading, which Moreau put in a footnote and never expanded, is that he was not from their past. The next question is the obvious one. If moments can overlap, why here? Why a garden in the northwest of a French estate rather than everywhere, all the time, for everyone? The answer the commission arrived at, and the answer Moreau found repeated in later documents almost word for word, is not about physics, it is about weight. Their model was this. Time does not lay down evenly. Most moments are thin. They happen, and they pass, and they leave almost nothing behind, and this is a mercy, because a world in which every moment persisted would be unlivable. The billions of afternoons in which nothing happened have gone, completely, and they are not coming back. But some moments are heavy, not because they are important in the way a history book means important, because of what was felt in them by how many people, in how small a space, over how long a period. And here you have to look honestly at what the Petit Trianon actually was. For roughly 15 years, that small building and its gardens were the only place on earth where the most scrutinized woman in Europe could be a person. Everything else in her life was performance. She was watched while she woke. She was watched while she dressed. She was watched while she ate by crowds, as a matter of formal ceremony. Her body had been public property since she was a child, and her failures in it had been discussed by an entire continent. The Trianon was the one door she could close, so she went there constantly. She went there to be dull. She went there to garden badly and put on amateur plays and sit on the grass and draw things she was not good at drawing. She went there to be a woman with an afternoon rather than a symbol with a country attached. 15 years of the most intense privacy any human being has ever needed, concentrated in a few acres. And then, at the end of it, the other thing, because the estate did not simply fade out of use. On a night in October of 1789, a messenger rode into those grounds to tell the Queen that a crowd had left Paris and was walking toward Versailles, and she left the Trianon at speed and never saw it again. The last thing that happened in that garden was terror. 15 years of one woman's only refuge, sealed at the end by the worst night of her life. If any place on earth were going to be heavy, it would be that one. The Commission's astronomer put it more coldly, and Moreau quotes him in the paper that ended his career. He wrote that the ground remembers pressure, and that we should not be surprised, since we have all seen a road hold the shape of a wheel long after the cart has gone. There is one more feature of the incident reports that Moreau found, and it is the feature that made him stop working alone. He had been sorting his 300 years of misfiled complaints by date, because that is what a historian does. On an evening in the autumn of 2017, for no better reason than restlessness, he sorted them instead by description. three figures came up again and again. An elderly man in working clothes, usually described as a gardener, usually seen at a distance, usually kneeling or bending toward the ground. He appears in 11 separate reports across 220 years. In 7 of them the witness mentions, unprompted, that he seemed to be burying or uncovering something. A woman carrying blue flowers. 9 reports. She's always walking, always in the same direction, always described as young, and in 4 of the accounts the witness notes that she was crying without making any sound. And a soldier. 14 reports, which makes him the most frequently observed of the 3, spread from 1794 to 1996. His uniform is described differently by nearly every witness, which is exactly what you would expect if 14 people from 14 different decades were trying to describe an unfamiliar military coat in the vocabulary available to them. But every single description agrees on one point. The uniform carries no insignia, no regiment, no rank, no badge, no braid, no marking of any kind. A soldier's coat with every trace of allegiance removed from it. None of the 3 has ever aged, none of them has ever spoken, and in the last, report from a security guard in the 1990s who was interviewed once and then transferred at his own request. There is a line that Moreau underlined so hard he tore the page. The guard said the soldier looked at him. Not through him. At him. Turned his head, found him precisely, held the look for what the guard estimated as 4 or 5 seconds, and then simply was not there. Everyone else in 300 years of reports had been oblivious. That one was not. Which is when Moreau began to suspect that not everything walking in those gardens was an echo. He published in 2018, quietly, in a small journal, with the fictional and speculative material stripped out and only the archival findings retained. The misfiled documents, the astronomical tables, the 84-year cycle, the commission. The paper was not attacked, it was not debunked, it was not, as far as he could tell, read at all. 6 weeks later he received a letter. It was handwritten on heavy unheaded paper, and it did not identify its sender. It contained no threat of any kind, and Moreau said afterward that this was the most alarming thing about it, because a threat would have told him he was dealing with people who were worried. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first congratulated him on the quality of his archival work, in specific and knowledgeable terms, mentioning 2 documents he had found and 1 he had not. The second observed that scholarship of this kind had been undertaken before, and that the results had been consistent, and that the writer hoped he would find the enclosed of use. The third said that the Correspondence Association had maintained an interest in the subject since 1795, and that its purpose was custodial rather than investigative, and that it would be glad to hear from him. Enclosed was a photocopy of a single page from a ledger. At the top of the page, in a heading, was a name, the Order of the Hourglass. Moreau spent 2 months deciding whether to answer, and answered. What he was told, over the following 3 years, by an organisation that has never confirmed its own existence, amounts to this. The order was founded in the winter of 1795 by 4 people. One was the astronomer of the Window Commission, who had survived the terror by being too obscure to be worth killing. One was the widow of the architect, who had not been. The other 2 are not named in anything Moreau was shown. Their reasoning was simple and, if you accept the premise, difficult to argue with. The commission had been a royal body. It had existed to protect a king. The king was gone, and everything the commission had known was sitting in boxes that were currently being sorted by revolutionary committees who were selling the furniture of Versailles by the cartload to anyone with money. Somebody was going to find those papers, and the astronomer had spent 30 years quietly convinced of one thing above all others, which was that the phenomenon could not be controlled, and that every attempt to control it would end badly for whoever attempted it. So they did not hide the papers. Hiding attracted attention. Instead, they did the thing Moreau had spent a year fighting his way through without understanding why. They scattered them. They separated the archive into individual documents and placed each one, singly, in an unrelated file in an unrelated collection. so that any one of them could be found by anybody, and all of them could be assembled by nobody. It is the most patient act of concealment I have ever heard described, and it worked for 223 years, and it was undone in the end by a man who happened to already be reading the boring files for other reasons. The order calls itself custodial, and it means that literally. It does not experiment. It does not investigate in any active sense. It maintains a list of sites. It monitors the cycle, and when a convergence approaches, it arranges through entirely mundane means for people to be somewhere else. A footpath is closed for drainage work. A section of woodland is fenced for tree surgery. A quiet stretch of road is resurfaced in a month when the traffic is light. You have almost certainly walked past their work and been mildly annoyed by it. Versailles, Moreau was told, is not special. It is simply the best documented, because it had the misfortune to have a palace built on top of it by a monarchy that wrote everything down. The list of other sites is not long. Moreau was shown a portion of it and permitted to describe it only in general terms. Certain stretches of Roman road, particularly where the modern route still follows the original line, and particularly at crossings. Several monastic sites, mostly ruined, where communities of people repeated the same actions in the same rooms at the same hours for 400 or 500 years without variation. Repetition in the order's model does the same work that intensity does. It is a different way of making a moment heavy. A small number of battlefields, not the famous ones, interestingly. The ones where something happened slowly. 2 forests, 1 mountain pass, and one thing Moreau found more unsettling than any of them, which is that the list has a shape. When plotted, the sites are not randomly distributed. They cluster along lines. The order does not claim to know why, and told him plainly that 3 centuries of trying to find the pattern had produced nothing but people who had wasted their lives on it. Every location shares a single quality, which the order describes in one sentence that has apparently been passed down in the same form since the 1790s. These are the places where history is reluctant to leave. The order keeps a second list, and it does not share that one at all. Moreau learned of its existence rather than its contents. It is a register of people who did not come back. Most overlaps are harmless because most overlaps are brief, and most people, encountering one, do the sensible thing, which is to become uneasy and walk on. That is the entire mechanism of survival here, and it is almost funny. The reason there is no great mystery in the historical record is that human beings, when a place feels wrong, tend to leave. The 2 English schoolteachers walked through the strangest 20 minutes of their lives without stopping once. They were frightened. They kept moving. They came out the other side. The order's position is that this is not a coincidence and is in fact the whole of it. Because occasionally somebody stops. Somebody stops and turns around and goes toward the thing rather than past it. Somebody follows the woman with the blue flowers to see where she's going. Somebody sits down on the grass beside the bored young queen because they have recognised her and cannot make themselves walk away. And what the order believes, on evidence Moreau was permitted to read but not copy, is that at some point the overlap resolves. 2 panes of glass. You can look through both. But you are standing on one of them, and if you spend too long attending to the other, at the moment the convergence closes, the question of which pane you are actually on becomes a real question with a real answer. The register is not enormous. The order has been keeping it since 1795, and Moreau was told the total is in the low hundreds across all sites, but it is not empty. And this is where the story stops being comfortable, because the order's model has an implication that its own members clearly dislike. If a person crosses over and stays, they do not vanish from history. They arrive in it. They arrive somewhere in some year, dressed wrongly, speaking oddly, unable to explain themselves, with no papers and no family and no plausible account of where they came from. And whatever happens to such a person afterward, whatever life they manage to build or fail to build, is not a mystery at all. It is a record. It is a parish register entry, a hospital admission, an unremarkable person of unknown origin who turned up one year and was absorbed. There are, In the archives of every country in Europe, thousands of such people. Moreau said the thing that stayed with him was not the idea of disappearing. It was the idea that some fraction of the historical record consists of people who were, from their own point of view, lost. During the Second World War, two separate intelligence services took an interest in Versailles, and Moreau's account of this is the most heavily qualified section of everything he assembled, because the documentation is thin, and the sources are second-hand, and he was careful to say so. What can be established is that between 1940 and 1944, at least 3 visits were made to specific sections of the Trianon grounds by German personnel whose stated purpose does not match their qualifications. 1 was a meteorologist, 2 were not. What can also be established is that in the summer of 1945, with the war in Europe finished and a great deal else to be getting on with, an Allied team spent 9 days conducting an unspecified survey of the same area, and that the resulting report has never been located. The attraction is obvious once you understand what was being claimed, and it has nothing to do with changing the past. Nobody in 1943 imagined they could go back and alter anything. The interest was intelligence, and intelligence is about observation. If moments can overlap, then a window that opened onto a specific past moment would be the only truly unbreakable form of surveillance ever devised. No cipher, no informant who might turn, no aircraft that might be shot down. Simply the ability to be present at a meeting that has already happened, and to see it, and to hear nothing, and to read the papers on the table. Both efforts failed completely. They failed for the reason the astronomer had written down in 1783, and the reason the order had been founded on in 1795, which is that the thing has never once been steered. It cannot be induced. It cannot be scheduled beyond the crude 84-year cycle. It cannot be aimed at a chosen year. It does not respond to equipment, and in the one case where equipment was extensively installed, the phenomenon appears to have simply declined to occur for the duration of the installation, which the technicians recorded as a null result, and which Moreau read rather differently. You do not open the window. The window opens, and it opens onto whatever it opens onto, and you are either standing there or you are not. In 2021, Moreau was given access to a private collection in England, and in it he found a notebook. It belonged to Eleanor Jourdain. It is not the manuscript of the famous book. It is a personal diary kept in her own hand, unpublished, and it contains an entry written in 1922, 2 years before her death, at a point when she had spent 21 years being publicly ridiculed and had never once altered her account. The entry is short. She writes that she's been thinking about honesty and about the difference between telling the truth and telling all of it. She writes that she and Moberly agreed at the outset to record only what could be defended, because they were serious women in serious positions and because one indefensible detail would have destroyed the credibility of the rest. Then she writes down the detail they left out. The lady on the grass looked up. Moberly had always maintained that the woman glanced at them the way anyone glances at a passing stranger. That is what appears in the book. That is what she repeated for 36 years. According to Jourdain's diary, that is not what happened. The woman on the grass lowered her sheet of paper. She turned her head, and she found them precisely the way you find a person you have been waiting for. She looked at Charlotte Moberly for what Jourdain estimated as several seconds, and then she smiled. Not warmly, Jourdain writes. Not unkindly either. She describes it as the expression of a person who has been told something in advance and is pleased to find it accurate. Jourdain then adds one line, and it is the last line of the entry, and Moreau said he read it standing up in a cold room in Sussex and had to go outside. She writes, "I have never been able to decide whether we were the visitors. There is a painting. It is not famous, and it is not good. It is one of dozens of competent estate views produced in the 1780s by minor artists for minor patrons, showing the Petit Trianon from the southwest on a summer afternoon, with the terrace in the middle distance and a great deal of carefully rendered foliage." Moreau went to see it in a regional museum in 2022 because it was on his list and he was being thorough. and he spent about 90 seconds in front of it before he noticed the two figures at the back. They are small. They are perhaps the height of a fingernail on the canvas. They stand at the left edge of the composition, on the grass near the tree line, slightly apart from the other stuff-edge figures the artist has scattered about to give the scene life. Every other figure in the painting is dressed as you would expect. These two are not. They wear long dark skirts to the ground, high at the neck with tight sleeves. One has a small dark hat. They are standing close together and both are facing the house. Moreau photographed the detail at the highest resolution the museum permitted and had it examined by two conservators, neither of whom he told what he was looking for. Both reported the same three things. The figures are original to the painting and not a later addition. The pigment layer is continuous with the surrounding work, and the costume, in the opinion of one of them, who volunteered this without prompting, is not 18th century at all, and appears to be an anachronism of the sort that occasionally occurs when a painting is restored badly, except that this painting has never been restored. The canvas is dated 1785. Charlotte Moberly was born in 1846. There is no signature and no record of who commissioned it, and the museum's catalogue entry consists of one sentence and a measurement. Which leaves the last question, and it is the one Moreau ended his notes on. Why is there a palace there? The standard answer is that Louis XIV built Versailles on the site of his father's hunting lodge, in the middle of a marsh, at enormous cost and against the advice of everyone involved, for reasons of politics and vanity and control. All of that is true, but the site was genuinely terrible. The drainage was a nightmare that consumed a fortune and killed workers. The water supply required one of the largest engineering projects of the age. Contemporaries said openly that it was madness to build there when better ground lay a few miles in any direction. He built there anyway, and he never explained why in terms that satisfied anybody. And 100 years later, his descendants' household was quietly funding a commission to monitor irregularities at the far end of that same estate, using astronomers who had been taking measurements since the 1670s. Since the 1670s. Since the beginning. Since before the gardens were finished. The commission's architect left drawings, and Moreau spent his final year of research on them. They concern the water. Versailles has more fountains than any garden on earth, and the hydraulic system that feeds them is one of the great engineering achievements of the 17th century, involving aqueducts, reservoirs, and a machine on the Seine so large it was considered a wonder of the age. The standard explanation is display. The king wished to command water as he commanded everything else. The architect's drawings show something else layered over the same plan. The lines of the watercourses, the placement of the basins, the angles of the great avenues of trees, and the geometry of the paths around the Trianon are annotated in the drawings, with the same four variables the astronomers were recording: solar angle, pressure, magnetic bearing, cycle. The garden is not decorated according to those measurements. It is arranged according to them. The order's interpretation, which Moreau reported without endorsing, is that Versailles was never built to cause anything. It was built to hold something still. The geometry, the water, the vast unnatural flatness imposed on a marsh, all of it acts in their model as a kind of stabilizer, spreading and dampening a phenomenon that had been occurring in that ground long before there was a France to build on it. The most expensive garden in human history, according to this reading, is a lid. And the order's chief concern, stated to Moreau once and never elaborated, is that lids require maintenance, and that the estate is now maintained as a heritage site rather than as whatever it was originally maintained as, and that nobody currently employed there knows what the pathways are for. In August of 2023, on the 10th of the month, Lucien Moreau walked the route. He did it alone. He told no one, including the order, and he wrote his account of it 4 days later in a hotel room in Rouen because he did not want to write it at home. He says the birds went first. He says he understood in that moment exactly what an old gardener had been told by his father in the 1760s, because the instruction arrives on its own. You do not want to turn around. It is not fear exactly. It is a sense that turning around would be a category error, like reading a sentence backward. He kept walking. The air went dead and the trees flattened and the light took on the quality both women had described and failed to describe. And Moreau, who had spent 11 years preparing for precisely this and had rehearsed a list of observations to make, found that he made none of them and simply walked. He came out near the terrace, and the gardens were wrong, not old. That is what he had expected, and it is not what he got. The lawns were gone to meadow and waist high. The terrace stonework had split and something was growing out of it. The great basin below was dry and cracked and full of leaves, and beyond it the long perspective that has been kept clear for 350 years was closing in with young trees. The little house was still standing. The windows were gone. Every statue he could see had come down. He was not looking at 1789. Standing on the broken edge of the terrace, perhaps 20 feet away, was an elderly woman in a long dark skirt and a high-necked jacket, with her hands folded watching him arrive. He knew her immediately. Anyone who has spent a decade with a photograph knows the face in it. Charlotte Ann Moberly, who died in 1937, at 91 years old in England. She did not look surprised. She looked, he wrote, like a woman who has been keeping an appointment. He did not manage to speak. She said 5 words quite clearly in English, in an accent he described as belonging to a century that has finished. She said, "You are much too early." And then there was sound. All of it at once. The birds and the wind and a coach party somewhere behind him, and an aircraft going over. And Moreau was standing on a mown lawn in front of an immaculate building, with the fountains running and a queue of tourists at the door. He sat down on the grass in front of everybody for about 10 minutes. Then he walked out through the gates and did not go back. In the spring of 2024, the estate announced that a section of the northwestern grounds would be closed to the public for restoration work. The notice was unremarkable. Such notices are posted constantly at a site of that size and age, and this one gave the usual reasons, which involved drainage and the condition of certain pathways, and nobody wrote about it because there is nothing to write about a footpath. The closure was scheduled for 18 months. It has been extended twice. The section that is closed contains no buildings of significance and no features that appear in any guidebook. It contains grass, a line of mature trees, and a slope where the ground falls away toward what used to be a small ravine before it was filled in during the 19th century. There is one photograph, taken from a public part of the estate with a long lens, that shows equipment inside the fenced area. It does not look like drainage equipment. It does not look like anything a landscape contractor would own. 3 of the units are mounted on tripods and oriented, as far as anyone can tell from the angle, at the sky. The Order of the Hourglass has never confirmed that it exists, and it will not. But if the astronomers were right, and if the cycle is what they said it was, then the last significant convergence at that site fell in the opening years of the 20th century, when 2 English schoolteachers went for a walk after tea. 84 years from 1901 gives you the 1980s. 84 years from there brings you into the middle of this century, which is close enough that a patient organisation with a long memory would already be preparing. They will not be there to study it. They will be there to make certain that everyone else is somewhere else, and that anyone who walks up that path on the right afternoon finds a polite sign and a fence and a note about drainage. So, what actually happened at Versailles on the 10th of August 1901? Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where the lights are low, the world outside has gone quiet, and the only thing left to do is close your eyes and listen. Before we begin tonight, I want to say a quick thank you to Patrick, who suggested tonight's topic. You asked for the Phoenix Lights, and you asked for the version of the story that lives underneath the version everybody thinks they know. So that is exactly what we are going to do tonight. Thank you for sending it in, and thank you for being part of this strange little community of ours. So get comfortable, turn the lights down or off, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, let your jaw unclench, take one slow breath in and let it out even slower, and let tonight go. We are going to Arizona. We are going to the 13th of March in the year 1997, and we are going to talk about the night that thousands of people looked up at the same time. This is the Phoenix Lights, the night they hid the sky. Before the story begins, imagine the desert. Not the desert of postcards, all orange rock and dramatic sunset. The other one, the one that exists after dark when the heat is finished bleeding out of the ground and the air turns thin and cold and clean. The kind of clean you can taste. The kind of air that carries sound too well so that a truck on a highway 4 miles away sounds like it is idling in your driveway. In March, Arizona nights are cool. The days can climb toward 80 degrees, but the moment the sun drops behind the mountains, the temperature falls like something dropped down a well. People go inside. They turn on their televisions. They start dinner. They put children in bathtubs and complain about work and let the day fold itself up and put itself away. Above them, the sky's enormous. That is the thing about desert skies that photographs never manage to capture. Not the stars, though. There are more of them out there than most people ever see in a lifetime. It is the emptiness between the stars, the scale of it, the way the darkness up there feels less like a ceiling and more like an ocean turned upside down over your head, and you're standing at the bottom of it, small and warm and entirely unaware of how thin the roof of your house really is. On the night of the 13th of March, 1997, that ocean moved, and thousands of people all across one state stopped what they were doing at almost exactly the same moment and walked outside and looked up. Let us begin with a man in the air. He's flying a routine approach into Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. It is an approach he has flown so many times that his hands make most of the small corrections before his brain has finished asking for them. The instrument panel glows a soft, familiar green. The cabin behind him is full of tired passengers who have already put their books away. Below him, the valley is spreading out in that grid of orange sodium light that every American city wears at night. Phoenix from the air looks like circuitry, perfect right angles, arteries of moving headlights, dark rectangles where the golf courses and the parks refuse to glow. Everything is normal. Everything is exactly the way it always is. And then the co-pilot goes quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a man concentrating. A different quiet. The kind of silence that arrives in a cockpit when somebody sees something they do not have a category for, and their brain is buying time while it searches for one. The pilot looks up. Ahead of them, and slightly above, there is a formation of lights. His first instinct is the correct professional one. Aircraft. Traffic. Something scheduled and explainable and boring. His eyes go to the shape and start counting, because counting is what pilots do. 5 lights, maybe 6, maybe 7, depending on how you interpret the ones at the outer edges. They are arranged in a wide, shallow V. They are not blinking. That is the first thing that is wrong. Every aircraft in the sky over the United States wears a specific arrangement of blinking lights, and pilots read those arrangements the way you read the letters on a road sign. Red on the left, green on the right, white at the tail, a strobe that pulses so that you can find the thing in the dark and judge its distance and heading. These lights do none of that. They are steady, amber or gold or a warm white that does not sit comfortably on any of those words. They simply burn. The second thing that is wrong takes him a moment longer. They are not moving relative to one another. If those were separate aircraft flying in formation, there would be drift. there is always drift. Even the finest military display teams in the world breathe a little as they fly, tiny corrections rippling through the formation as each pilot fights the air. These lights hold their positions as though they have been painted onto a single sheet of glass. The third thing that is wrong is the worst: the stars. The pilot follows the shape of the V with his eyes and realizes that between the lights, where there should be sky, there is nothing. No stars. The constellations he has known his entire adult life simply stop at one edge of the shape and pick up again on the other side, as though something enormous and completely dark has been laid across them. The co-pilot finds his voice. He asks in a low tone whether the pilot is seeing the size of that thing. The pilot does not answer, because he is doing arithmetic. He knows his altitude. He can estimate his distance from the object by the way the city lights below it are being interrupted, and from those two numbers he can work out how wide the thing has to be, and the number that comes back is so absurd that he throws it away and does the arithmetic again. He gets the same answer. He does not say the number out loud. Not that night, not for years. He reaches for the radio instead. Air traffic control acknowledges. Their voice is calm, professional, unhurried, and for one brief exchange there is a completely ordinary conversation about unusual lights in the airspace north of the field. Another aircraft chimes in. Someone else has eyes on it too. There is a moment, no longer than a minute, in which the whole thing is being handled the way anything unusual gets handled in aviation, which is to say methodically and without drama. And then the radio changes, not dramatically. Nothing so obvious as a click or static or a voice being cut off mid-word. It is subtler and, to a pilot, far more strange. The subject simply ends. The controller moves to the next transmission, then the next. Vectors, altitudes, runway assignments. The ordinary rhythm of the night reasserts itself, and the enormous silent shape hanging over the northern edge of the valley is not mentioned again by anyone on any frequency for the remainder of the approach. The pilot will think about that for the rest of his life, not the lights, the silence afterward. As he turns onto final, he sees something else. Off to the west, far out toward the ranges where the military owns most of the ground and all of the air above it, aircraft are climbing. He can pick them out by their strobes, hard white pulses stitching upward through the dark, several of them, moving fast. He feels for a moment something close to relief. That is the system working. That is exactly what he would expect. An unidentified object of that size, over a metropolitan area, and somebody's going up to have a look at it. Intercept, identify, escort it out of the airspace if necessary. Good. He lands. He shuts down. He walks through the terminal with his flight bag over his shoulder, past passengers on payphones and cleaning crews and a bar with a television, turned to a basketball game. He goes to his hotel. He sleeps. And for years, that is where the story sits in his memory. A strange formation, an odd radio silence, and a scramble of military aircraft doing their job. It is only much later, when he is retired, when he has read enough accounts and cross-referenced enough timelines and spoken to enough people who were also awake that night, that he goes back to that final image and looks at it properly. The aircraft were climbing to the west. The object was to the north and heading south. They were never on an intercept course. They were not going to meet it head-on. They were not going to box it in. They were rising into a position ahead of it and slightly below, on a heading that would let them fall into place around it as it passed, the way a motorcade forms up around a vehicle it is protecting. The pilot spends a long time trying to find another word for the manoeuvre he watched that night. The only word that keeps fitting is escort. That is where we will leave him for now, standing in an empty hangar decades later, with a coffee going cold in his hand, having just realised that the most extraordinary thing he ever saw was not the object. It was the way everyone else in the sky behaved around it. Now let us go down to the ground. The first calls come from the north. It is somewhere around 7:30 in the evening, In the small communities scattered along the high desert corridor between the Nevada line and the mountains above Phoenix, dinner is being cleared away. Kids are avoiding homework. Somebody's walking a dog along a road with no streetlights, because out there, streetlights are a thing that happens to other people, and a man in a place called Poulden looks up. Poulden is not a city. It is barely a town. It is a scatter of homes and ranch properties on high open ground, where the wind comes down off the plateau, and the night sky above it is one of the darkest in the continental United States. When you look up in Poulden, you see the Milky Way as a genuine river, a bright smear of dust and light that our ancestors named and worshipped and navigated by, and that most modern people have never once seen with their own eyes. The man is not a UFO enthusiast. He has never called anyone about anything in the sky in his life. He is simply outside doing something ordinary, and he glances up. There are lights coming down from the northwest, 4 of them, maybe 5, moving together in a formation that is impossible to mistake for stars because stars do not travel, and impossible to mistake for aircraft because aircraft make noise. He waits for the sound. That is the detail he will repeat to everyone who ever asks him about it. He stood there, in the freezing high desert air, with his head tilted back, and he waited for the sound, and it never came. Not a rumble, not a hum, not the distant tearing whisper of a jet at altitude. The light slid across the entire visible sky, from one horizon toward the other, in complete and total silence. He goes inside and calls the National UFO Reporting Center. It is the first documented report of the night. It will not be the last, because the thing, whatever it is, keeps going south, and south of Poulden is Chino Valley, and south of Chino Valley is Prescott, and Prescott Valley and Dewey, and south of those is the long descent through the mountains, and then the enormous glowing bowl of the Phoenix metropolitan area, home at that time to well over 2 million people. The object is heading directly toward all of them. In Prescott, a man is outside with his son when they notice a cluster of lights approaching from the north. He's a person who pays attention to aircraft. He knows what a plane looks like at night, and he knows what a plane sounds like at night, and this satisfies neither definition. He watches the formation pass almost directly overhead, and what he describes afterward is not the lights at all. It is the shape between them. He says the stars went out. He says he could trace an outline by the absence of stars, a vast, dark, wedge-shaped nothing gliding above him, and the only way to perceive it was to watch the sky itself being erased section by section as it passed. That description, or some version of it, is going to be repeated by witness after witness after witness across the entire length of the state. It becomes the signature of the event, not the brightness, the blackness, not what people saw, what they stopped being able to see. In Dewey, a family stands in their driveway. In Chino Valley, a woman calls her neighbour and tells her to come outside right now. In Cordis Lakes and Black Canyon City and Anthem, people who have no connection to one another and no way of coordinating their stories are all doing the same thing at the same time, which is standing very still in the cold with their heads tipped back, feeling something they mostly cannot describe. Several of them use the same word later. The word is wrong. Not frightening, not exciting. Wrong. As though a fundamental rule about how the world is supposed to work had been quietly suspended above their houses, and they could feel it in the base of the skull the way animals feel a storm coming. Speaking of animals. Across the northern corridor, dogs go strange. This is one of the more consistently reported and least discussed details of the entire event. Dogs that never bark start barking. Dogs that always bark go silent and refuse to move. Horses in corrals bunch against fence lines. Cattle drift toward the far corners of their enclosures and stand there, facing the same direction, which is not toward the lights, but away from them. By 8 o'clock the emergency lines are lighting up. Try to picture the inside of a dispatch centre on a normal Thursday night in March. It is a room built for a specific and predictable kind of chaos. Car accidents, domestic disturbances, chest pains, a bar fight. The people who work there have heard everything, and the reason they are good at their jobs is that almost nothing genuinely surprises them anymore. Now picture that room when every line starts ringing at once. The callers do not sound like the callers dispatchers are used to. They are not screaming. There is no emergency in the ordinary sense. Nobody is bleeding. Nobody is in danger. What the dispatchers hear instead, over and over, is a particular quality of voice that is much harder to handle than panic. It is the sound of a reasonable adult trying very hard to sound reasonable. They apologise before they describe anything. They say they know how this sounds. They say they are not the kind of person who calls about this sort of thing. A nurse, a machinist, a retired police officer, a man who flew helicopters in the service, and who therefore has spent more hours looking at the night sky than the dispatcher has spent awake this month. And then they describe the same thing. Lights in a V, silence, enormous, slow. Some of them ask questions the dispatchers cannot answer. Somebody wants to know if there is an air show. Somebody wants to know if the base is running an exercise. Somebody wants to know if they should get their children away from the windows. And a number of callers in different towns at different moments ask a version of the same question, and it is the question that will eventually become the whole story. They ask why nobody is stopping it. Because that is the thing. If a slow-moving object the size of several city blocks drifted over the middle of America with no transponder, no radio contact, and no engine noise, at an altitude low enough that people on the ground could see it blot out constellations, something should happen. Sirens, jets, announcements. A voice on the radio telling everyone what is going on. Instead, there is nothing. The object crosses the entire state on a leisurely southbound course, over a major metropolitan area, over an international airport, over a region ringed by some of the most heavily used military airspace in the United States, and the response, from the outside, appears to be nothing at all. By around 8:30, it is over the valley itself. Now the witness count goes from hundreds to thousands. This is the part of the story that separates the Phoenix Lights from almost every other case in the history of the subject. Most reports of unidentified objects are lonely things. One person on a back road, a couple on a beach, a pilot with a story and no corroboration. They can be dismissed easily because there is nothing to hold them up. That night, an entire metropolitan area was a witness. People saw it from freeway overpasses and stopped their cars on the shoulder. People saw it from restaurant parking lots. People stood on the flat roofs of apartment buildings. A father woke his children and carried them outside in pyjamas because he understood, in some instinctive way, that this was going to matter later. Neighbours who had never spoken stood together on lawns. A woman in Phoenix later described a moment that is, to me, the emotional centre of the whole event. She said the strange part was not the object. The strange part was the sound of a city noticing something at the same time. She said she could hear, from her own front yard, doors opening up and down the street. She could hear the specific rhythm of screen doors banging and voices calling out, and footsteps on driveways spreading outward like a ripple, as one house after another realised that something was happening and came outside to look. Thousands of people in the dark on their own lawns, all silent, all facing the same direction, and above them, sliding south, that immense soundless wedge. Some of them filmed it. That is the other thing that makes this case unusual. This is 1997, a few years before everyone had a camera in their pocket, but camcorders were common enough that a number of people got footage. The video is famously unsatisfying, which is the curse of every event like this. Bright points on a black field. No sense of scale, no sense of the thing between the lights. But there is one detail the footage does capture, and it is the detail that unsettles researchers to this day. The lights do not wobble. Handheld footage from that era wobbles constantly. Any object being filmed by a person standing in their yard drifts around in frame. But when you track the lights relative to each other across the footage, they hold. The geometry does not change. Not a degree, not a fraction. Whatever those lights were attached to, they were attached to the same thing, and that thing was very, very large. Now, the governor, the man in charge of the state of Arizona in March of 1997, was named Fife Symington. He was a Republican, a former Air Force officer, and importantly for this story, a pilot. He knew aircraft. He had spent time in the sky and around people who spent their lives in the sky. On the night of the 13th, he received information about what was happening. Calls were coming into state offices as well as local ones. Something was moving over Arizona and thousands of people wanted to know what it was. Months later, in June, with the story refusing to die and news outlets still pushing for answers, the governor held a press conference. He announced that he had found the culprit. The doors opened and in came a figure in a silver alien costume, complete with an oversized head, escorted by a deputy. The room laughed. Cameras flashed. The joke played on the evening news across the country. The message could not have been clearer, and it did exactly what it was designed to do, which is make an entire subject unsafe to discuss in public. If you were a serious professional in Arizona in the summer of 1997, that press conference told you something very specific. It told you that if you said what you saw out loud, you were going to be filed away with the man in the rubber suit. People stopped talking. Not all of them, but many. And that is where the story would have ended, except for what happened roughly a decade later. Fife Symington gave an interview and said that he had seen it too. He described being out that night, looking up and watching an enormous object move through the sky above the valley. He described it as something that did not match any aircraft he knew of, and he was a man who knew aircraft. He said it was massive, and that it was unlike anything he had encountered in his life. He was then asked the obvious question: why the costume? Why the joke? His answer was, in its way, more chilling than any conspiracy theory. He said he was worried about panic. He said that as governor, with thousands of frightened people calling in and no explanation available, his job was to keep the state calm. So he did the one thing guaranteed to diffuse the situation instantly. He made it funny. He turned an unexplained event into a punchline, and in doing so, he shut the whole thing down. Now, sit with that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. A sitting governor of an American state watched something in the sky he could not explain, judged that the public could not handle the truth of his own uncertainty, and deliberately used ridicule as a tool of crowd control. He did not lie about facts. He did something more elegant than that. He made the facts embarrassing to mention. That is the point in this story, where the official record and the conspiracy start walking beside each other for a while, close enough to touch. Because here is what the official record eventually settled on. The United States Air Force stated that the lights seen hovering over the Phoenix area later that evening in the 10 o'clock hour were illumination flares. Specifically, flares dropped by aircraft from the Maryland Air National Guard during a training exercise over the Barry Goldwater Range, southwest of the city. High-intensity flares suspended under parachutes, drifting slowly downward, hanging in a line in the sky, and then extinguishing one by one as they burned out or dropped behind the Estrella mountain range. And I want to be fair here, because this is important. That explanation genuinely does account for a large portion of what people photographed that night. The famous still images of a row of lights hanging over the city, the ones that appear in every documentary, are consistent with flares. The way the lights blinked out in sequence is consistent with an object dropping behind a mountain ridge. That part of the case is, for most researchers, considered reasonably well explained. The problem is the timing. The flares were in the 10 o'clock hour. The formation, the enormous silent V that crossed the entire state, was seen 2.5 hours earlier, moving from north to south, hundreds of miles from the range, over an area where no flares were dropped. Two separate events, one explained, one not. And the official record, in the eyes of many witnesses, quietly used the explanation for the second one to make the first one go away. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is just how information behaves when it is handled carelessly, or carefully, depending on your assumptions. But now let us step over the line. From here on, Everything you hear is fiction, a story, a speculation dressed up in the clothes of a real knight. Nothing beyond this point should be mistaken for history. Let us go to Luke Air Force Base. Luke sits west of Phoenix, out where the suburbs finally give up and the ground goes flat and pale and empty. In 1997 it is a fighter training base, one of the busiest in the world, and on any given night there are technicians in dim rooms watching screens where every aircraft in a vast volume of airspace appears as a small moving symbol. In our story, one of those technicians is a young sergeant. It is a Thursday. His shift is unremarkable. He's watching commercial traffic stack up into Sky Harbour and a handful of military tracks working in the ranges to the south. Then the northern edge of his display develops a problem. There is a return there that should not exist. It is enormous. Not enormous like a heavy transport aircraft, enormous like a weather event, and it is coming south at a speed so slow that at first he assumes it is ground clutter or an artifact, some ghost thrown up by the system. He reports it. His supervisor comes over. They look at it together and do the thing that professionals do when the instruments say something impossible, which is start checking the instruments. While they are doing that, the phone rings. Then it rings again, then a third line. The base is getting calls from civilians, from local police, from other facilities. Everyone is asking the same question, and the sergeant, watching that vast, slow return crawl down the middle of his screen, realises that the instruments are not malfunctioning at all. But that is not the part he will remember. The part he will remember is the second track. At some point after the formation crosses into the southern half of the state, a separate return appears on his display, southwest of the metropolitan area, out over the empty ground where the ranges begin. It does not fly in from anywhere. It does not approach from the horizon. It simply is there, one sweep after not being there, and it is descending. He watches the altitude readout tick downward, not falling, not tumbling, a controlled, deliberate, absolutely steady descent, the numbers rolling down at a rate so consistent that it looks less like an aircraft and more like an elevator. He calls it out. His supervisor does not respond the way he expects. There is no confusion, no scramble to verify. Instead, the supervisor looks at the screen for perhaps 2 seconds, picks up a phone, dials a number he does not have to look up, and says a short sequence of words the sergeant does not understand. Within 4 minutes there are people in the room who do not work in that room. The sergeant is moved. Not removed, not questioned, simply and politely relocated to a different position, where a different screen shows a different volume of airspace. He's told the second track is a scheduled activity and is being handled at another level. When he comes back on shift 2 days later, the recorded data for that period is gone, not corrupted, not classified with a note in its place. Gone, as though the night had a hole cut out of it. He asks one question about it, gets one look in response and never asks again. And for 20 years he tells nobody, because he has a career and a family, and because the entire country has been taught, by a man in a silver costume on a stage in June, that this subject is a joke. But he never forgets what the readout looked like, because in his entire career he never once saw an aircraft descend that smoothly. Aircraft fight the air. Every foot of altitude an aircraft gives up is a negotiation with physics. The numbers stutter, they pause, they correct. That night the numbers came down like water finding a drain. Whatever it was not flying. It was arriving. Let me tell you about the ground beneath that descent. Southwest of Phoenix, past the last strip malls and the last irrigated fields, the map of Arizona changes character. The roads thin out. The names on the map stop referring to towns and start referring to features, mountains, washes, tanks, wells that were dug a century ago by people who did not survive the experience. And then, across an enormous span of that emptiness, the map turns into a single restricted block. The Barry Goldwater Range is a military training area larger than several American states. It stretches from the edge of the Phoenix metro region all the way down toward the border. A a span of desert and mountain and dry lake bed that has been closed to the public since before most people listening tonight were born. Aircraft train there, ordnances dropped there. There are places inside it where nobody has walked in living memory, and other places where the ground is so littered with the leavings of half a century of exercises that walking is genuinely lethal. It is one of the most perfectly isolated pieces of ground in the developed world. It is ringed by mountains that block line of sight. It is patrolled. It is legally sealed. There is no highway crossing it, no town inside it, no reason for a civilian ever to be there, and the entire nation has been trained for decades to accept, without curiosity, that things happen in there which are none of their business. If you needed a place to bring something down where no one would see it, and you had the entire continental United States to choose from, you would choose this. In our story, that is exactly what somebody did. The planning documents, as they are described later, refer to something called a corridor, not a road, a route, a pre-approved sequence of movements, ground and air, running from a specific access point on the eastern boundary of the range to a set of coordinates roughly 40 miles inside it, with timings, checkpoints, and a list of units authorised to move along it. It has a name that sounds like paperwork, because that is how these things always sound. The most extraordinary operations in history are hidden inside the most boring language available. Nobody investigates a logistics annex. The corridor was written years before that night. It had been maintained, updated and reissued annually, like a fire drill nobody expected to run. On the evening of the 13th of March, 1997, it was activated for the first time, and that brings us to the flares. The official account of the later lights over Phoenix is, as I said, reasonably solid. High-intensity illumination flares, dropped in a line, hanging under parachutes, drifting and burning and dropping out of sight behind the mountains. But consider the geometry for a moment. Those flares were dropped in the airspace above the northern section of the range. From the perspective of a person standing in Phoenix, they hung in the western sky, right along the horizon, right above the mountains, right in the exact direction of the second track's descent. Now imagine you are a person in a suburban backyard that night. You have just watched something enormous cross the sky. You are shaken. You have called your family. You have called the news. And now, out west, a line of impossibly bright lights appears above the mountains and hangs there for minutes on end. Where are your eyes? They are up. They are locked on the horizon. They are pointed at the brightest thing in the sky. Every camera in the valley that night, every camcorder and every news crew and every police officer stepping out of a cruiser to look, all of them aimed at that line of light. And a line of light, hanging in the sky, is very good at hiding the ground beneath it. Look at a bright object at night for even a few seconds, and your eyes give up on everything darker. That is not a theory. That is just how the human eye works. A flare is not only a source of illumination, it is a source of blindness. According to the conspiracy, that is what they were for, not illumination, attention. While an entire metropolitan area stood in its yards and stared west at a row of burning lights, the thing that mattered was happening beneath those lights and behind those mountains, on the floor of a sealed desert range, in the dark. And there was exactly one person on the wrong side of the fence. His name, in our story, is Samuel Harlan. He is 61 years old. He runs cattle on a lease that shares its western boundary with restricted federal land, and he has done so for 34 years. He is a widower. He lives alone in a low house with a metal roof and a porch that faces the wrong way for sunsets, which he has always regretted. He is not the kind of man who believes in anything unusual. He's the kind of man whose entire life is a negotiation with weather, water, and the price of beef. His imagination, such as it is entirely occupied by fences. On the evening of the 13th, he is doing what he does most evenings. He has eaten. The television is on in the other room, tuned to nothing in particular, providing that low murmur that people who live alone use to keep the house from being too quiet. At around 8:45, the cattle start moving. He hears it before he understands it. There is a specific sound to a herd going wrong, a rolling drum of hooves and a rising pitch of noise, and any rancher knows it in his spine before his brain catches up. He's on his feet and out the door with his boots half on. The herd is running, not drifting, not milling, running, hard, in one direction, and the direction is east, away from the range, away from the mountains. They are pressing against the eastern fence line with enough weight that he can hear the post complaining 1/4 mile away. He shouts at them, which does nothing. Then he notices the dogs. He has 3. They are working dogs, and their entire purpose in life is to be exactly where cattle are being loud. They should be out there already. Instead, they are on the porch, all 3, pressed flat against the boards with their bellies down and their ears back, and when he calls them, not one of them moves. One of them is shaking. He goes back inside for a flashlight and hears that every radio in the house has gone to static. The television in the other room is doing the same thing, a wall of grey noise where a picture used to be. The little transistor radio he keeps on the kitchen windowsill, the one he uses for market reports, is hissing. He stands in his own kitchen and feels the hair rise on his forearms, and then the valley turns blue. Not from above. That is the detail he cannot ever get people to understand afterward. It did not come down from the sky like lightning. It came from beyond the western ridge, throwing light upward and outward, so that for perhaps 4 seconds the underside of the entire cloud layer, the ridgeline, his barn, his hands, everything, was lit in a cold, pale blue that had no flicker in it at all. Flame flickers. Lightning stutters. This was constant, like a switch had been thrown. Then it faded. Not abruptly. It dimmed, evenly and smoothly over several seconds, and the darkness that came back afterward was darker than before, the way it always is after your eyes have been given something bright to look at. Sam Harlan does what any rancher in America would do at that moment. He assumes it is a fire, because that is the only thing out there that makes light, and a fire on that ground, in that wind, with his herd on the wrong side of it, is the single worst thing he can imagine. He grabs the flashlight and the truck keys and drives up the track to the top of his own ridge, and he gets out and he looks west. There is no fire. There is an object in the air roughly 2 miles away above the flat, and it is coming down. He describes it later in the flattest possible language, which is what makes his account so hard to dismiss. He says it looked like a shape with lights on it. He says he could not tell what colour it was because it did not seem to have a colour, only edges. He says it was big, and when pressed on how big, he compares it to the grain elevator in the town where he was born, and then, after a long pause, says that maybe it was bigger than that. It descends without sound. No engines, no rotor wash, no roar of displaced air, not even the high whine of something electrical under load. 2 miles is close enough that any conventional aircraft of that size would be shaking the ground under his boots. He hears the wind. He hears his own truck ticking as it cools. That is all. The object settles into a dry wash below the ridge, and dust rises around it in a slow, pale ring, and then the ring drifts and thins, and the desert goes quiet. And when I say quiet, I mean something specific. Sam Harlan has spent his entire life outdoors at night, and he will tell you that the desert is never silent. There is always something. Insects, wind through creosote, a distant dog, the tick and settle of ground giving up its heat. For a period he estimates at somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes there was nothing. He stood on that ridge in a silence so total that he could hear the blood in his own ears, and he understood, in a way that had nothing to do with thinking, that he was not supposed to be there. Then he heard the helicopters. They came from the north, low and fast, and they were dark. He counted 4, then 6, then lost count as they crossed the ridge and dropped toward the wash. No navigation lights, no strobes, just a hammering wall of sound arriving where, moments before, there had been no sound at all. Behind them, on the ground, the trucks came. Sam Harlan stood on his own ridge, on his own land, in the dark, and watched a convoy move along a track he'd assumed nobody used anymore. Heavy flatbeds with low loaders, vehicles with plating on them, 2 buses with their windows blacked out, which is the detail that stayed with him the longest, because a bus means people, and a blacked out bus means people who are not supposed to see where they're going, or people who are not supposed to be seen. The convoy went through the boundary gate and into the range. He waited on that ridge for a long time. He does not know how long. Long enough that his hands got cold on the truck door and he did not notice. Nothing came back out. He drove home. He did not sleep. At dawn he went out again and looked west, and there was nothing to see, because there is never anything to see out there, and by then even he was starting to talk himself out of it. 2 days later, 2 men came to his door. They were polite. They were not in uniform. They said there had been an aircraft incident in the training area, and that debris may have been scattered, and they asked, in the pleasant tone of people who have asked this question many times, whether he had found anything unusual on his property. He said no. They gave him a phone number and told him to call if that changed. And then one of them, on the way back to the vehicle, said something that Sam Harlan turned over in his head for the rest of his life. He said it casually, the way you say something that does not matter. He said it was a shame about the noise, and that he hoped it had not frightened the animals. Sam had not mentioned the animals. He had not mentioned anything. The story of what happened inside the range that night comes to us, in this telling, through a woman named Dr. Claire Morgan. She's a former Air Force engineer. She spent 11 years in aerospace materials work, most of it dull, some of it classified, all of it conducted inside a system where the most important skill is knowing which questions have no upside. She leaves the service in the early 2000s and moves into private research, and she becomes interested in the way careful people become interested in things, in a very specific anomaly. Not lights, not sightings, paperwork. Her insight is a simple one, and it is the reason her fictional investigation feels so plausible. She reasons that no matter how secret an operation is, it still has to be paid for, staffed, supplied, and cleaned up. Aircraft have to be fueled, personnel have to be housed, equipment has to be signed out and signed back in, and every one of those transactions leaves a residue in the mundane administrative record, because you can classify the mission, but you cannot classify the diesel. So she does not look for the secret, she looks for its shadow. And in a set of routine logistics records covering the spring of 1997, she finds a designation that does not appear in any published program list, tucked between entries about hangar maintenance and vehicle servicing. Project Sunset. The description attached to it, when there is one, is Aerospace Recovery Logistics Support. That is a phrase engineered to make your eyes slide off it. It sounds like a team that goes and picks up crashed drones. But she starts building a timeline of every date Project Sunset appears in the record. There are 9 dates over a 14-year span, and every single one of them, without exception, falls within 72 hours of a documented cluster of unexplained aerial sightings somewhere in the American Southwest. Not near them, within them. The 13th of March, 1997, is one of the 9. What she pieces together about the recovery itself is fragmentary, which is exactly how she would expect it to be. There is no single document that says what was found. There is instead a scatter of ordinary records that describe, collectively, something extraordinary. There are requisitions for cutting equipment, which is normal for a crash recovery. Then there are follow-up requisitions for different cutting equipment, escalating in capability over the course of 2 days, ending with a request for industrial diamond abrasives and a plasma unit normally used in heavy shipbuilding. Whatever they were trying to get into, they could not get into it. There is a materials analysis request that includes a line item Morgan has never seen on a crash recovery form in her life. It asks for lattice imaging at atomic scale. That is not the sort of test you run on aircraft wreckage. You run that when you want to know how something was made, at the level of individual atoms, because nothing about how it was made makes sense. The summary of that analysis, if it ever existed, is not in the record. What survives is a single follow-up memorandum, and its entire content is a request for guidance on how to classify a material that does not correspond to any entry in the standard reference index. Morgan reads that sentence many times. It is not a claim about aliens. It is not a dramatic statement. It is a mid-level technical officer, working within a bureaucracy, politely asking his superiors what box to put something in, because none of the boxes fit. That, she says later, is what convinced her. Not the extraordinary claims, the ordinary confusion, but the metallurgy is not the strange part. The strange part is the biology. Roughly 19 hours after the first convoy entered the range, a second group was moved in. Morgan traces them through housing allocations and transport manifests, because people have to sleep somewhere and eat something, and those records are astonishingly persistent. The second group is small, fewer than a dozen. Their equipment list is not an engineering list. It includes refrigerated containment units. It includes portable laboratory modules of a type used for handling biological material under isolation. It includes full environmental suits with independent air supply, of a specification well beyond what you would wear for fuel vapour or composite dust. It includes surgical instruments. Morgan reads that list as an engineer and reaches an engineer's conclusion. No aircraft accident of any kind involving any technology in the world in 1997 requires you to fly in a sealed cold storage unit and a set of scalpels. You bring cold storage when there is something that will spoil. You bring scalpels when there is something you intend to open. And you bring isolation suits when you genuinely do not know what you're about to be exposed to. She never finds a document that says what the second team found. She finds only the shape of the space where that document should be. But she does find one more thing, and it is small, and it is the kind of detail that sits in your chest afterward. In a transport request for that second team, someone filled out a field labelled Special Handling Requirements. They wrote a single instruction: maintain temperature, do not open, now let us bring in the man who carried it. In this story, his name is Captain David Mercer, and he is a retired Air Force transport pilot. In the spring of 1997, he was 38 years old, flying cargo runs, holding a clearance, and doing the thing that transport crews do, which is move things from one place to another without asking what they are. 23 years later, he contacts a journalist named Rebecca Sloan. He does not do it dramatically. He does not use a burner phone or a parking garage. He sends a short email from an account created for the purpose, saying that he flew a cargo run out of Arizona in March of 1997, and that he has thought about it every week since, and that he is now sick, and that being sick has changed his arithmetic about what he owes to whom. Sloan has heard from a lot of people who claim to have flown a lot of things. What makes her answer him is a detail in the second paragraph. He does not tell her what was in the container. He tells her he does not know. The people who are lying always know. His account, when she finally sits across from him, is short. That is the other thing that persuades her. It takes 11 minutes to tell. He was pulled off his scheduled rotation on short notice and sent to a field in Arizona he had not flown into before. He waited on the ground for 6 hours. He was not briefed on cargo. He was told the flight was a priority movement to a facility in Nevada, and he was given a routing that kept him away from populated areas in a way he found unusual. The cargo was loaded at night, under lights, by personnel who were not part of the ground crew. It was one container. He describes it precisely, because pilots describe things precisely. It was roughly the size of a large chest freezer. It was sealed. It had an external power connection, and it was drawing power the entire flight, feeding a refrigeration unit that ran continuously, which is why he could hear it over the aircraft. 2 armed personnel flew with it. They did not sit. They stood, one at each end, for the entire flight. They did not speak to the crew. When Mercer asked one of them a routine question about strap tension, the man looked at him and said nothing at all. And the weight. Mercer remembers the weight because weight is the one number a transport pilot cannot ignore. Every flight is arithmetic. You cannot fly what you cannot lift, and you cannot balance what you do not measure. The manifest listed the cargo at exactly 312 pounds. He tells Sloane that he has spent 2 decades trying to make that number make sense. £312 is nothing. It is a motorcycle. It is a large man and his luggage. It is not an engine, not a wing section, not a fuselage panel, not a piece of any aircraft that would justify an armed escort, a dedicated flight, a specialised routing, and a refrigeration unit running for the entire duration. Whatever they were moving out of Arizona that week, it was small, cold, and worth more than the aircraft carrying it. Rebecca Sloane does what journalists do. She files requests. Under the Freedom of Information Act, she asks a series of agencies for radar records, communications logs, and flight activity data covering the evening of the 13th of March, 1997, over the state of Arizona. The responses take months. Some take years. And what comes back is not a wall of refusal. That is the part she finds most interesting. A flat refusal would be simple. A flat refusal is a door, and doors can be pushed on. Instead, she gets cooperation. She gets envelopes. She gets discs. She gets pages of tracking data, some of it genuinely useful, some of it redacted in the ordinary way, all of it delivered with the polite institutional shrug of an organisation that has nothing to hide and is happy to prove it. And then she starts assembling it into a timeline, and she notices the whole. Every source she has from every agency covers the evening thoroughly. Traffic into and out of Sky Harbour, military activity in the southern ranges, the routine, grinding, extraordinarily well-documented business of American airspace. Except for one interval. There is a 23-minute window that is simply not represented anywhere. One agency reports that records for that period cannot be located. Another provides a file that begins after it. A third sends a dataset with a gap in the middle and an apologetic cover letter about archival transfer errors during a system migration in the early 2000s. Different agencies, different formats, different explanations. The same 23 minutes. Sloane is not a naive person. She knows records get lost. She knows migrations corrupt data, and boxes get misfiled, and things genuinely, boringly disappear all the time. If one agency had a gap, she would think nothing of it. 4 agencies losing the identical interval is not an accident. It is a policy that was implemented separately in 4 places, which means it came from somewhere above all 4. And when she overlays that window on the rest of the timeline, it sits exactly where the second track descends. Not near it, on it. Whatever happened in the sky southwest of Phoenix that night, it took 23 minutes, and someone decided the country did not need those 23 minutes back. The other thing Sloane does, and it takes her 4 years, is collect witnesses. She ends up with more than 200 first-hand statements gathered from people who were outdoors in Arizona that night. She organises them by location and by time. She cross-references them against each other. She's not looking for the dramatic accounts. She's looking for the boring ones, because the boring ones are the ones nobody has polished. And in that mass of testimony she finds a pattern that almost nobody talks about. The people who are furthest from the object describe lights. The people who are beneath it describe an absence. Witness after witness who claim the object passed directly overhead uses some version of the same phrasing. They say they did not see a craft. They say they saw nothing at all. No hull, no panels, no seams or rivets or exhaust or texture, no surface of any kind. They say the stars went out. One woman, a schoolteacher in her 50s, describes lying on the hood of her car with her head back as the thing passed above her, and says that what frightened her was not that something was there. It was that nothing was there, and yet the sky was gone. She says it was like watching a hand pass in front of a window from the inside of a dark room. You do not see the hand, you see the window stop working. Sloane writes one line in her notes about this, and it is the line that keeps her awake. If it had no surface anyone could see, then everyone who says they saw the Phoenix lights is wrong about what they saw. They did not see a craft with lights on it. They saw lights, in a formation, around something that was not there, which raises a question that changes the shape of the entire story. What if the lights were not part of it? What if the lights were around it, the way a motorcade's lights are around a car? What if the reason the formation was so perfect, so unwavering, so geometrically flawless across every second of every piece of footage, is that it was not one object at all, but several, holding station around something enormous and dark that none of them wanted anyone to look at directly? That, according to the conspiracy, is what happened. The greatest mass sighting in modern American history was not a visitation. It was traffic control. Here is where Dr. Morgan's paperwork and Sloane's testimony finally meet. Morgan, still following the shadow of the money, finds that Project Sunset is not a program. It is a subordinate function. It is the field element, the people with the trucks and the cold storage, activated when needed. Above it sits something with a broader charter, and its designation is Operation Mirror. The name appears rarely, and never with a description. Morgan builds a picture of it the way you build a picture of a dark planet by watching what orbits around it. What orbits around it is not recovery work, it is analysis, linguistics, mathematics, signal processing. Long-term funding for antenna arrays with no published purpose. Personnel with backgrounds in cryptography and information theory attached, on paper, to an aerospace logistics office. You do not need cryptographers to pick up wreckage. You need cryptographers when something is talking. The conclusion Morgan reaches, and she reaches it slowly and reluctantly over the course of 6 years, is that the purpose of the larger program was never retrieval at all. Retrieval was housekeeping. The purpose was contact. Not the kind of contact people imagine, with landings on lawns and speeches at the United Nations. Something far less cinematic and far more bureaucratic. A long, patient, one-sided correspondence conducted across decades by a small number of people inside a system designed so that no single participant ever saw the whole shape of it. And once she accepts that, the timeline of the 13th of March stops looking like a crisis. It starts looking like an appointment. Because look at the sequence again. The corridor plan was written years earlier and maintained annually. The recovery zone was already selected. The units were already positioned. The aircraft that dropped the flares were operating on a training schedule that had been on the books for weeks. The second team, with its refrigeration units and its isolation suits, was assembled and moved with a speed that no organisation on Earth achieves from a standing start. None of that is a reaction. All of it is preparation. In the story, Sloane eventually gets a piece of paper that makes it explicit. It is a fragment of an assessment, undated, mostly redacted, and what survives is a single projection concerning an object on a determined trajectory, with an estimated atmospheric entry window and a recommended recovery footprint. The recommended footprint is the Barry Goldwater Range. The window is the second week of March, 1997. They knew it was coming. They knew roughly when. They knew roughly where. They had chosen the ground and staged the equipment and written the paperwork, and they had every reason to believe that this arrival, like every arrival before it, would happen in the dark, in an empty place, with nobody watching. There was only one variable they did not control. The object came in over Phoenix, and here is the detail that turns the whole thing over. It did not have to. Sloane works the trajectory backward with a physicist. From the direction of approach and the observed track, an object entering the atmosphere on that heading, aiming for that landing area, had an enormous range of possible paths. It could have come in from the south, over the border, over empty ground the whole way. It could have come in from the west, across the desert, and never passed over a settlement larger than a gas station. Instead, it came down the length of the state, on a slow, low, deliberate line, directly over the largest concentration of human beings within 500 miles, at an hour of the evening when the greatest possible number of them would be at home, outdoors, awake, and looking up. If you wanted to be seen by as many people as possible, and you had the entire sky to choose from, that is the path you would fly. That is what Sloane finally writes in her notebook, at 2 a.m, in a hotel room in Tucson, 4 years into the work. She writes that the object wanted witnesses, and somebody else spent the rest of that night and the following 20 years making sure the witnesses could be laughed at. David Mercer gave Rebecca Sloane one more thing before he died. It was a cassette tape. He explained where it came from in the flat, unhappy voice of a man confessing to something small and stupid that turned out to matter. On the night he waited on the ground in Arizona before his cargo was loaded, he spent a period of hours in a facility where he had nothing to do. He had a small recorder with him, the kind he used to leave voice notes for himself, and at some point he left it running in his flight bag and set the bag down in a corridor outside a work area. He did it, he said, for no good reason at all. He was bored. He was uneasy. Something in the atmosphere of that night made him want a record of being there, and he could never explain the impulse better than that. He did not listen to the tape for 11 years. When he finally did, he stopped after the first pass and did not play it again. The recording is poor. There is machinery running somewhere. There is a low, constant hum, and the acoustics are hard and echoing, the sound of a large space with a concrete floor. Voices come and go as people move past the bag. For most of its length, it is meaningless. Fragments about power, about cabling, about somebody being needed at a particular door. Then there is a stretch of about 90 seconds, where a small group of people are standing close enough to be understood. The first voice is male, older, and sounds tired. He says that the hull integrity is intact. A second voice, further away, answers that the inner compartment should be opened. There is a pause. There are sounds that are difficult to identify. Something metallic, something being moved. A rising note that might be a tool or might be the recording itself failing. Then the tape goes almost silent, and stays that way for a long time. Sloane measured it. 22 seconds. 22 seconds is an extraordinarily long time for a room full of working people to say nothing at all. Then a voice, closer than the others, quiet, not addressed to anyone in particular, says that there is no pilot. And a fourth voice, calm, unsurprised, and completely level, answers. He says that there never was one. Sloane plays that section perhaps 200 times over the following year. She has it analysed. She has the room's dimensions estimated from the reverberation. She has the 4 voices separated and counted. But it is not the words that convince her. It is the tone of that last answer. Because a person discovering that a craft has no pilot would sound astonished. A person who had never considered the possibility would ask a question. A person encountering the greatest surprise in the history of their species would not sound like that. The fourth voice sounds like a man confirming a delivery. There never was one, not a discovery, a correction. Somebody in that room already knew, and had known for a long time, and was gently informing a colleague who had walked in with the wrong expectations, which means the pilot was never the point. So what was? The engineering assessments Morgan eventually pieces together give an answer that is stranger than either woman anticipated. The object had no cockpit. It had no seating, no controls, no interface designed for hands or eyes, or any body of any shape. It had no propulsion system that anyone could identify, and no fuel, and no visible means of having moved at all. It had no navigation equipment. It had, in fact, almost nothing. The overwhelming majority of its internal volume was solid, not hollow, not compartmented. Solid material, arranged in that impossible lattice, doing something that nobody in 1997 could describe. And in the centre of it, there was one active component. One. It was transmitting. A narrow, low-powered, extraordinarily stable signal, aimed outward, away from Earth, on a bearing that did not vary. It required no maintenance and drew power from something nobody located. It had been transmitting when it came down. It transmitted through the recovery. It transmitted in the hangar and on Mercer's aircraft, and in whatever facility in Nevada it went to afterward. It was still transmitting decades later. The content of the signal was not language. It was mathematics, a sequence, repeating, unvarying, with a structure so simple that the cryptographers assigned to it had nothing to do within the first week. It was not a message, it was a beacon, which is where the story arrives at its final and quietest turn. Nearly 30 years after the 13th of March, 1997, Rebecca Sloane is old and tired and has published almost nothing about any of this, because at every step the evidence has been the kind that convinces the person holding it and nobody else. She has one loose end left, the signal structure, the sequence itself. She has never been able to make it mean anything, because she has been trying to read it as information, as words or coordinates, or a description of something. One night, unable to sleep, she stops trying to read it and simply plots it. Values against time, the most boring thing you can do with a data set. And the shape that appears on the page is a line, descending. The sequence is not a message. It is not a signature or a location or a greeting. The numbers are getting smaller, at a rate so slow and so exquisitely regular that across 3 decades of continuous transmission, it has moved only a fraction of the way toward its end. But it has moved. It is counting. And when she extends the line forward and finds the point where the value reaches 0, she gets a date. A specific one, not tomorrow, not next year. A date still some years out from where she sits, close enough that she can imagine the weather that day. She sits with that piece of paper for a long time, then she puts it in a drawer. She publishes nothing, not because she is afraid, though she is, a little. She publishes nothing because she has finally understood what she would be publishing, and she can think of no version of the sentence that helps anybody. 6 weeks later, an envelope arrives at her home. No return address, no note. Nothing inside but a single photograph, printed on the heavy matte stock that satellite imagery used to be printed on, with a corner of a classification stamp still visible at the edge where somebody trimmed it badly. It is a wide overhead image of a stretch of desert. Mountains at the top edge, a dry wash running diagonally, vehicle tracks converging on a single point from 3 directions. It is the recovery site. The timestamp along the border is the morning of the 14th of March, 1997. The object is not in the image. By that hour it has already been lifted, crated, driven out along a corridor that was written years in advance, and flown to Nevada by a tired man who never learned what he was carrying. The convoy is still there. She can count the vehicles. She can see the shadows they throw, long and westward, in the low early light. And beside them, perhaps 300 yards off, on open ground, there is a second shape. It is not a vehicle. It casts a shadow that does not match anything else in the frame. It is not covered, or crated, or surrounded. Nobody appears to be near it. Nobody appears to be attending to it at all. It is simply there, at the edge of the site, in the daylight, in the open, watching. So let me leave you with this. As the room goes soft around you, and the story starts to come apart into pieces, for nearly 30 years, the Phoenix Lights have been argued about as though the argument were about the lights. Were they flares, or were they something else? Were the witnesses mistaken, or were they lied to? Thousands of people, one sky, one endlessly repeating debate. According to the conspiracy, everybody has been arguing about the wrong thing the entire time. The lights were never the mystery, they were the escort. The formation that crossed Arizona that night, so silent, so perfect, so impossible to photograph properly, was not the visitor. It was the company it kept, and the thing it was surrounding was already on its way down toward a piece of sealed ground selected years earlier by people who had known the appointment was coming. And when the whole state stood in its yards and looked west at a line of burning lights hanging above the mountains, they were doing exactly what they had been arranged to do. They were looking at the sky. While the only thing that ever mattered was happening on the ground, in the dark, beyond the ridge, 300 yards from a rancher who could not sleep, inside a silence so complete that even the insects stopped. History remembers the Phoenix Lights as one of the great unexplained events in American life. According to the conspiracy, The lights were never unexplained at all. They were the camouflage. And somewhere, in a building nobody will name, in a container nobody will open, a signal that has been counting down since 1997 is still counting. Sleep well.